Vine Church, warning. This one's a little deeper and a little longer than we normally go, but we're going to give it a shot anyways. Welcome to the Midweek Pick Me Up. Let's jump right in. Galatians chapter 5, verse 1 says, "It is for freedom that Christ set us free. Do not be subject again to a yoke of slavery." And if you're thinking to yourself, didn't we cover this last week? Yeah. But we asked the question last week, free from what? This week, I want to answer the question, free to what? What are you free to do? Well, in order to do that, we got to get into the mind of Paul and understand his narrative and articulation of the gospel. And so I need you to concede with me some baseline beliefs, even if you don't necessarily do. Just concede them for the sake of understanding what Paul's saying here in this particular passage. Number one, God is the creator of everything, and everything bears his fingerprints. Number two, God created you and me, his highest form of creation, all humanity, and we too bear his image. And number three, this image is part of the reflection that we see in creation of his character, his nature, what God's like. We see that in creation. There's a widespread agreement around the world of what God is like. He's full of love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, and self-control. These are the words that Paul chooses in articulating this God. When you and I act in love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, and self-control, we reflect the nature, the character, the DNA of God himself. But you look around worldwide and it's a mess. You see brokenness. You see not love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, self-control. You see hate. You see division. You see racism. You see greed. You see greed instead of charity. You see sexual conquest instead of sexual intimacy. You see hate and division instead of unity and love. That's just the world we live in. What went wrong? Well, according to Paul in his narrative, in the New Testament's narrative, we were created one way. God created the world to work one way. And now, because of the presence of sin in the world, everything's been corrupted. It's come in and infected everything. Everything and everyone. We're all misshapen. You see, over and over again in the biblical narrative, Satan, who is the personification of evil, is presented as offering an alternative to God that is perverse. It perverts God's original design, and we see that everywhere. Instead of love, we see hate. Instead of charity, we see selfishness. Instead of intimacy, we see perversion. Everywhere. So, how does this get fixed? Well, along comes the gospel. Along comes the good news of Jesus. And Paul says, don't you see, we were enslaved to a pattern of brokenness, and we couldn't get out. It was so bad that even when God gave us a clear articulation in the law of the morality that best reflects his character, we couldn't do it. We were a slave to sin and a slave to brokenness. And then Galatians chapter 5, verse 1. It is for freedom that Christ set you free. Free to do what? Hear me on this and listen carefully. Free to live as you ought. Free to do as you ought to do. You say, well, wait a minute, hold on. I thought freedom was like freedom to do whatever I wanted to do. Well, no, that's never been freedom. That's licentiousness. But hear clearly what Paul's saying. You're now free from the old pattern. And the old pattern was, even if you wanted to live a life that honored God, that reflected his nature, that was in tune with his created order, we couldn't do it. But now, the Holy Spirit's taken up residence inside the life of the believer. And instead of from the outside in, from the inside out, the Holy Spirit is doing the work to renew our hearts. In the book of Galatians, he sets these two metaphors at odds. He says, the law is symbolized in the cutting of the flesh and circumcision, but in the gospel, we're cut to the heart. Our hearts are changed, and from the inside out, we begin to desire, and get this, we begin to desire to do the thing we ought to do. What? Think about it this way. What is true freedom for you? Is it the ability to do anything you want? Is that true freedom? When's the freest you've ever felt in your life? If you really think about it, wasn't it those moments that you were doing something that you really wanted to do? Something that you really wanted to do that was in tune and in step with something that was healthy and beneficial for your heart and your soul. I mean, isn't that the case? Whether it was a day at the beach with a loved one, whether it was a long hike with someone close, whether it was building a business with coworkers and friends, whether it was making memories with the family, something. These moments where you felt so free. You were free to do what you ought to do because it was the way you were designed to be. This is what Paul has in mind when he says, it is for freedom that Christ set us free. Do not be subject again to a yoke of slavery. You don't go back to following the rules that from the outside telling us what we had to do in order to make ourselves right before God. No. You have been made right before God. You have been given grace. And now that you've been given this grace, you're being changed from the inside, and the Holy Spirit is bringing about, renewing a desire to live as you were always made to live. In a path that includes love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, and self-control. You don't have to be told anymore to love these things. You don't have to follow a list of rules that says do these things. You now love it. You want to. It's what you've always wanted to do. You were just on a broken path. We were just enslaved. I don't know if I could say it any better. I'm sure there are people who have said it better than me. But that is what Paul's talking about. That's what true freedom is. When we begin to live as we were always made to live. Not because we have to, not because we're guilted into it, not because we're shamed into it, not because we're told to, not because we're trying to justify ourselves, not because we're trying to be right before people, but because it's what we love. Get there. May the Holy Spirit take you there. As far as we can go over tonight, I'll see you this Sunday. Love you. Mean it.